One of the most interesting potentials of the Xenomorph's unique biology is the possibility that they have a form of genetic memory. In today's dialogue, I want to explore if this is the case or not, and if it is, what it means for the Xenomorphs as a species, and how it explains the memories that the clone Ripley 8 was able to retain from her predecessor in the form of Ellen Louise Ripley. But let's start at the beginning. Research primarily conducted by the facility known as the Cold Forge gathered information about how the Xenomorph acquires its genetic traits. It begins with the FaceHugger, which stores within itself a substance known as Plagiaris praepotens. These are a cocktail of mutagenic chemicals that also contain a pure strain of the Xenomorph's genome, which can then be deposited into a host. These chemicals have a large connection with that of the engineer's accelerant. After the hugger attaches itself to a host, it inserts its ovipositor into their throat, depositing these praepotens, leading them to enact a breakdown of the host's genetic materials and begin a process to produce a viable chestburster embryo from the chemical chaos ensuing. As this occurs, the Xenomorph DNA reflex kicks in, and between 2 to 20% of the host's DNA can combine with the Xenomorph's pure strain of DNA, resulting in the chestburster possessing certain attributes or traits from its host. We see its phenotype displayed depending on its host organism. Human spawn Xenos are bipedal and generally more intelligent, while those spawned from quadrupedal hosts are likewise quadrupedal and sometimes more aggressive. From this point, we now have to explore how in this process the creatures actually pass on their genetic memory, if they have it, and whether or not they can only carry memory through their genetics, or can they also pass on memories of their host somehow onto the next generation of Xenomorph XX121s. Now, while the exact methods of their ability to accomplish this feat is yet to be understood, we at the project believe that it is almost a certainty that they have some kind of unique and fascinating method of generational memory transfer. It is possible that their unique genetics have some kind of method for coding specific and important information from their brainwaves into their own genetic information and code, allowing any offspring that come from these xenomorphs to inherit its queen's memory, and potentially memories from its original host. But with our limited knowledge of these processes, it's best that we just explore the examples that we have seen of this process across the Middle Heavens. The first example of this genetic memory present in the Xenomorph species was seen on the planet LV-871 during a Xenomorph infestation of that world. Our report comes from a young boy known as Maxson Krieger. This individual survived the decimation of his home world by a Xenomorph infestation. However, he was orphaned in the process. Unfortunately, his mother succumbed to a chestburster, which developed to adulthood. This particular Xenomorph stalked Maxson and his surviving companions. However, there is something particularly interesting about this Xenomorph, and that is that it showed the affinity at first to resist attacking Maxson in specific, which itself seems to be driven by the fact that the host was Maxson's mother. Eventually, much later on their journey to find safety on LV-871, just before their escape of the planet, Maxson finds himself confronted by a queen and her brood. However, just at the moment that death was to befall him, the Xenomorph spawned of his mother turned against its queen and made a savage attack against her in an attempt to protect Maxson. Well, at least that's what it seemed like to him. This gave him enough time for him and his remaining companions to escape from the colony. For a xenomorph to completely turn against its own queen and fellow hive members, it would take and need to overcome its telepathic link to her. Something of that magnitude would take a considerable amount of determination, which in this case could have been driven by the genetic memory transferred to the xenomorph from Maxson's mother. And in this case, it was her fiery maternal instinct for protecting her child that was obtained during the DNA reflex procedures. So in my humble opinion, and the opinion of most of the project, is that yes, they do have genetic memory, and that this memory can also be obtained, or memories can be obtained from the host organism from which they were spawned. This would allow them to learn and become smarter through successive generations. And sometimes random memories from the host might somehow be able to be obtained from the host during the DNA reflex and the chaotic nature of that process. A counterpoint to this argument might be that this particular xenomorph might have instead been challenging the queen for dominance over the control of the hive on the planet. And while I think this is actually very possible, I think its unwillingness to attack Maxson also provides enough evidence that there is clearly more going on here. Our second example would be that of the xenomorph nicknamed Big Chap. It seemed to have decimated the crew of the USCSS Nostromo in the year 2122, and more specifically its violent actions towards one of the crew members in specific. After killing all but 3 crew members, this xenomorph eventually took to ending the life of crew member Parker, and then quickly turned his attention to crew member Joan Lambert. From this point, something horrific yet interesting occurred. Up until this point, the xenomorph had either cocooned its victims or just outright killed them. With Lambert though, this was different. She received special treatment beyond the simple act of violence to end her life. No, in her case, the xenomorph acted with what can be compared to sexual aggression. Now, while the xenomorph is at a basic level a very pseudosexual creature, there are a few important facts to review. We can speculate that the original host of this xenomorph, crew member Kane, was potentially heavily interested in Lambert sexually. This primal desire could have transferred from host to spawn and resulted in the Big Chap having a particular interest for Lambert, which could have been the reason Lambert's body was so severely disfigured from the violent and sexual attacks of the beast during her end, beyond that of anything seen with the other crew members. However, it's just as likely that the creature only took its time with Lambert due to her being the only prey left and not having to defend itself against anything else, and so it resorted to playing with its prey. And the last and possibly most convincing example of genetic memory within the xenomorphs comes to us from the events that occurred on the USM Auriga in the year 2381. The ship was conducting xenomorph experiments, with samples of xenomorph tissues recovered from Fiorina 161 and the facility there, after the death of Ellen Ripley. The samples themselves coming from her own genetic material that had already almost completed the process of spawning a xenomorph queen. The United Systems military were able to eventually create clones from this genetic material, and in doing so, eventually were able to create near pure xenomorphs that still had a little too much human DNA within them, and a Ripley clone who had a considerable amount of xenomorph genetic materials within her genotype. These cloned xenomorphs and the clone Ripley, who would become to be known as Ripley 8, both would separately come to show examples of inherited genetic memory. The clone xenomorphs appeared to be able to recognize that their acidic blood had the power that it did, without having seen it in action ever before, as they had developed in captivity, Without seeing them learn about this previously, the creatures were able to escape their holding cages by killing one of their own kin, allowing its blood to eat through the floor panels and giving them a hole to escape through. The thing is though that you could argue that this is an instinctual act and not something derived from the memory of previous generations. I would counter that in saying that something of this level of sophistication would require time for any creature, no matter how intelligent, to master. However, there are animals that seem to have prior knowledge of their own amazing capabilities without learning about them prior, and simply have the instinct to do so. So, at this point, it's really up for debate whether the clone xenomorphs inherited memory. But, as we speak about our very last example, that of Ripley 8, we get undisputed evidence that at least some kind of genetic memory exists within the xenomorph biology. With Ripley 8 being a clone of the original Ellen Ripley, and therefore lab-grown from an embryo, there should be no possible way that she was able to retain any sort of memory from her previous life. She would have the genetics of Ellen Ripley, but Ellen's memories, thoughts, dreams and wishes all died with her on Fury 161. So how then does Ripley 8 actually have a substantial amount, albeit patchy, memory of who she was before being cloned, going to the length of almost being able to remember Newt or her daughter Amanda? Well, there is really only one explanation at this point, and that is that Ripley 8 and her hybrid DNA have allowed her to retain the memories of her previous self. This could have occurred while the queen embryo was developing within her on the planet Fury, just before Ellen's death. We know that the creature was already nearly fully developed, and so it had already performed the DNA reflex on Ripley. It's possible that through whatever process the xenomorph retains genetic memory, that it was able to capture some of the host's memories, and so later when Ripley was cloned to become Ripley 8, that the combination of the hybridization with the xenomorph's genome and the genetic memory functionality gave her the ability to retain some of what made her Ripley, and carry this fragmented knowledge on with her into her new life. We have always considered that the xenomorphs, much to the degree of the regards of the android Ash on the US CSS Nostromo before its demise, is the perfect organism, unclouded by conscience, remorse, or delusions of morality. But maybe that's not always true. Maybe sometimes the xenomorph's ability to steal traits from its host to make it a more efficient killer can lead to its downfall. Maybe in the process of trying to steal from humanity, it can gain a little of its own. Before you go, I wanted to let you know about the ACHERON Colonial Marketplace, the one-stop shop for all Project ACHERON merchandise. All proceeds go to fund our future endeavours under the project, so if you want to support the channel and look good doing it, pick up some ACHERON merch. But what other data logs would you like to see? If you have any ideas or have any questions to be answered, please leave them in the comments or contact me directly through the Project ACHERON Discord. If you enjoyed today's segment, please leave a like and share the video. And if you really want to support what we do here and gain access to a bunch of awesome rewards, consider becoming a Project ACHERON channel member, like Project Director Chris Dasinger and team member Raunchy. I hope to see you all here again very soon, but until then, this is the ACHERON Project signing off.